All right, well, my family's the last one to be ready for class, including me right now, so thanks for your patience. Good morning, everybody. We are going to be in Nehemiah chapter 13 for our study this morning. If you want to be opening up there, Nehemiah chapter 13. Just to sort of set the stage a little bit, I was thinking about this, and sometimes you read something and I think this is a very vivid story and you can see it unfolding in your mind and you see a lot of the efforts of Nehemiah, and I was thinking, if this was a movie, a biopic of Nehemiah, like we would have already faded to black, like he's in some ways completed his mission and he heads back to Persia and he's brought reform, and that seems like a nice place to end. If we want a happy ending, there it is. But he actually comes back into town, that's what we're going to read about today, and sees that his reforms haven't stuck in the way that he would want. And so that's what we're going to be talking about. But before we get too far into that, let's open up with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we are grateful to be here this morning. We're grateful for the word that you have spoken that is still living and active and can cut and pierce our hearts. Help us this morning to present open hearts to you and to see you fully and to be molded and fashioned by the truths here in your word. In your Son's name, amen. All right, so we're in chapter 13, and just to sort of get us going, last time we covered chapters 10 through 12, and sort of working backwards. In chapter 12, we ended with the joy of the Lord and what the joy of the Lord means and how it's not necessarily feeling good all the time, but it's that sense of knowing God and being in the right place and doing the right things. We talked about this list of people in chapter 11 who were willing to take on the hard work of going and populating Jerusalem when it was desolate. And then what I really want you to think about from the last class is chapter 10, where we talked about the signed covenant. The people get together again and they make a document and they write their names to it and they say, we are going to be faithful this time. We're going to get it right. We're going to come back to God. And we talked about some of the specific things that they promised in chapter 10. I'll just tick through them real quickly. So they say 4 things by my list that they promise that they're going to do in chapter 10. We're going to obey all the commandments, right? We're just going to be generally faithful to the law. We're going to stop intermarrying with the people of the land. That's a lot of what got us into this mess to begin with. We're going to honor the Sabbath, and we're going to take care of the temple. And we mentioned in our last class that you could go right through that list and compare it to chapter 13 and find that in all 4 of those areas, they failed in our text today. So that's going to be what we're thinking about. Why did the change not stick? Why did they go right back into their old habits, and what can we learn from that? Still got tiny font on our title, so I'll just read aloud for us. But I said, physical and moral walls have been built around Jerusalem, but now will they stand? They're put to the test. We've rebuilt the walls, and we've worked to redefine the distinctiveness of the people, and now it's finally being put to the test. Are the people going to stay true to the things that they promised? And we've talked about the fact that the answer is not so good. So in just a second, we're going to get into the text and read it and start to discuss it. But just to give you a sense of where we're going, we're going to go fairly quickly through the chapter to just get the facts and get the story and understand the ways in which the covenant was broken, the how. How did this happen and what were they doing that was wrong? We're going to look at Nehemiah and his drastic response. He is not going to let this go quietly. And then what I really want us to think about at the end of class is, why did this happen and what can we learn from it that applies to our own lives? So let's get into our text, Nehemiah chapter 13, verses 1 through 14. Tim, Ailey, would you mind to read those verses for us?
On that day they read from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people. And in it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God, for they did not meet the people of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. And our God turned the curse into a blessing. As soon as the people heard the law, they separated from Israel all those of foreign descent. Now before this, Elisha the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, and who was related to Tobiah, prepared for Tobiah a large chamber, where they had previously put the grain offering, the frankincense, the vessels, the tithes of grain, wine, and oil, which were given by commandment to the Levites, singers, and gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priest. While this was taking place, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king. And after some time, I asked leave of the king and came to Jerusalem. And then I discovered the evil that Elisha had done for Tobiah, preparing for him a chamber in the courts of the house of God. And I was very angry, and I threw all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber. Then I gave orders, and they cleansed the chambers, and I brought back there the vessels of the house of God, with the grain offering and the frankincense. I also found out that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them, so that the Levites and the singers who did the work had fled each to his field. So I confronted the officials and said, "Why is the house of God forsaken?" And I gathered them together and set them in their stations. Then all Judah brought the tithes of the grain, wine, and oil into the storehouses. And I appointed as treasurers over the storehouses Shemaiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and Pedaiah of the Levites, and as their assistant Hanan the son of Zakkur, the son of Mattaniah, for they were considered reliable, and their duty was to distribute to their brothers. Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for his service.
Thank you. Okay, so where was Nehemiah when all of this was taking place? Yeah, so he has to go back to Persia in verse 6. While this was taking place, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king. And so earlier in the book, we're told that he leaves for Jerusalem in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, and now in the 32nd year, it's time to go back, which that makes sense. You know, he's been in Jerusalem for 12 years. He's established the reforms. He's laid things out, and he at least needs to go and check in, if not go back permanently to his supervisor, in this case, the king. And when he comes back, there's a lot not to like. It's going to be more interesting coming from you than from me. So I'd want us to just kind of make a list, look through verses 4 through 14, and tell me what you see that is wrong or that's not the way it's supposed to be. Yeah, so you can start right there in verse 4. Eliashib the priest, who was appointed over the chamber of the house of God and was related to Tobiah. And you know your red flag should go up and you say, how could the priest be related to the guy who had been one of the biggest enemies of God's people? You know, and I think it's interesting that in verses 1 through 3, it tells us that the people had made a specific effort to cast the Ammonites and Moabites out the way they were supposed to. Does anybody remember Tobiah what was his nationality? Ammonite. So if they would have followed through and adhered to what they should have done, they never would have let Tobiah back in. But somebody makes a compromise. And not just somebody, but one of the priests says, okay, you can be part of my family. And not only do they let him sort of into the Jewish family, but what else is going on with Tobiah? Yeah, he's got some rooms. He's got a suite of rooms in the temple. And it's almost unfathomable that could be the case, right? I mean, you see the response of Nehemiah in verses 8 and 9, or I guess 7 through 9. But in verse 8, he says, I was very angry, and I threw it all out, and I gave orders, and they cleansed it, and then I brought back the vessels of the house of God. I mean, you think about the efforts that the people have undertaken to get back on the right track, and the promise that they made, we're going to take care of the temple, and we're going to take care of the temple servants, and now there's cronyism and favoritism, and not just helping a relative, but helping a relative who's outside of God's people and saying, why don't you take a couple of the rooms in the temple for your own personal use that were supposed to be storing things for this purpose of worship and dedication. Okay, what else do you see? Yeah.
So I've made this comment a couple times in this class, I think, but Tobiah is supposed to be a bad guy. That's his role.
Mm-hmm.
But Eliashib, the priest, I got a note to go back to chapter 3 and verse 1. Eliashib, the high priest, rose up with his brothers the priests, and they built the sheep gate. I mean, he's the high priest, and he was helping to accomplish this great project in this whole book. And he's the weasel. And it seems to me like that would be the place where we focus our eyes to say, not Tobiah. We all know he's the bad guy. We all know what should be. It's Eliashib who messes up by inviting and letting the bad guy in.
Yeah, definitely. We can't overemphasize the idea of distinctiveness and separation that's supposed to be coming in this book. And then right away you see that they've gone away from that and are compromising again. What was the situation? Yeah, go ahead, Lena.
I was going to say that people aren't setting aside portions for the Levites.
Yep.
They have to go back to work, which was not the intention.
Yeah, perfect. That's exactly what I wanted to ask or bring out next. In verse 10, I also found out that the portion of the Levites had not been given to them, and they had to go back out to their fields. So you remember, laid out in the old law was that the Levites were going to be taken care of through the sacrifices and through the tithes, and that would allow them to be devoted wholly to the work of God. And yet they're not being taken care of, and so they kind of have to fend for themselves, and they go back out and they're trying to farm and make something to where they can scrape out an existence. And so Nehemiah, in verse 11, I confront the officials and said, why is the house of God forsaken? You know, there's nobody there. The people who are supposed to be running it aren't running it because you're not taking care of them. And it is worth remembering, earlier in the book, there's a lot of talk about sort of how heavy the burdens of taxation were on the people. And in chapter 5, they say, we can't pay, and we're having to sell our kids into slavery, and they're dealing with a lot of financial issues. And I think you can imagine them, once Nehemiah is away, saying like, whoa, this is a lot to give, this is expensive and costly, and maybe we won't give at least the full amount. And that's kind of spiraled to a point where now the Levites aren't even being taken care of. Anything else that you see just in terms of what's gone wrong in these first few verses? All right. I think that's all the major ones. Like I said, we're going to just kind of go through the facts fairly quickly so that then we can, once we've got the whole chapter under our belt, we can discuss kind of what's going on, how Nehemiah is responding, how we got in this situation. So let's read the rest of the chapter, verses 15 through 31. Jay, would you mind to read that for us?
Where do you want me to start? 15 through...
Through the end of the chapter.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
In those days I saw in Judah some who were treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in sacks of grain and loading them on donkeys, as well as wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loaves. And they brought them into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. So I admonished them on the day they sold food. Also men of Tyre were living there who imported fish and all kinds of merchandise, and sold them to sons of Judah on the Sabbath, even in Jerusalem. Then I reprimanded the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this evil thing you are doing by profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers do the same, so that our God brought on us and on this city all this trouble? Yet you are adding to the wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. It came about that just as it grew dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors should be shut, and that they should not open them until after the Sabbath. Then I stationed some of the servants at the gates, so that no load would enter on the Sabbath day. Once or twice the traders and merchants of every kind of merchandise spent the night outside Jerusalem. Then I warned them and said to them, why do you spend the night in front of the wall? If you do so again, I will use force against you. From that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath. And I commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves and come as gatekeepers to sanctify the Sabbath day. For this also remember me, O my God, and have compassion on me, according to the greatness of your loving kindness. In those days I also saw that the Jews had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. As for their children, half spoke in the language of Ashdod, and none of them were able to speak the language of Judah, but the language of his own people. So I contended with them and cursed them and struck some of them and pulled out their hair and made them swear by God, you shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor take of their daughters for your sons or for yourselves. Did not King Solomon, king of Israel, sin regarding these things? Yet among the many nations there was no king like him, and was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, the foreign women caused even him to sin. Do we hear about you that you have committed all this great evil by acting unfaithfully against our God, by marrying foreign women? Even one of the sons of Jehoiada, the son of Eliashib, the high priest, was son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite, so I drove him away from me. Remember them, O my God, because they have defiled the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood of the Levites. Thus I purified them from everything foreign and appointed duties for the priests and the Levites, each in his task, and I arranged for the supply of wood at appointed times and for the first fruits. Remember me, O my God, for good.
Thank you. Okay, so if the first section wasn't disappointing enough, now we're definitely disappointed, right? How is the Sabbath being treated?
Just like any other day.
Yeah, like any other day, right? You can almost hear the disbelief in the text. He said, I saw people selling and transacting business on the Sabbath in Jerusalem itself. I hear the tone of, you've got to be kidding me, you know? Like, he can't imagine that the Sabbath has been turned into this. I mean, what was the purpose of the Sabbath originally? Why was it there? Right, to commune with God. And we see repeatedly throughout the Old Testament that it gets thought of as a burden. You know, it's thought of as a prohibition of what we can't do and just the things that we have to stop and we can't be transacting during this day. And the prophets will talk about they can't wait until the sun goes back down on the Sabbath so they can get back to the things they really want to do at various points in Jewish history. And this was supposed to be this special occasion for them to be with God. And not only, in this case, are they wishing it was over, they're just acting as if it doesn't even exist. You know, let's just push on. I need to turn a profit. I need to take care of myself. Remember, I mean, they were poor people, and they were trying to get back sort of to an established daily life. And so you can understand the temptation to just say, let me just keep transacting and doing business and harvesting and doing all the things I need to do on this day. I really can't afford to take a special day off yet. Yeah, Jessica.
You know that people know Nehemiah has come back, and yet, you know, you walk in on your kids and they're doing something, they straighten up really fast. But yet they're still blatantly, sweeping or showing all of this in front of everybody. Nehemiah is here, and they have no shame in thinking, oh, well, let's at least put up a good front while he's here.
Yeah.
They're just blatantly going about their business like
Yeah.
normal.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's maybe part of what exasperates him so much. And I meant to bring this out earlier. We really don't know how long Nehemiah was gone. There are different estimates, and so it doesn't ultimately matter that much. Some of the estimates that I saw were maybe around 10 years. You know, he'll talk at the end of this chapter that some of the kids who were born in foreign marriages are speaking a different language, and you think like, well, that probably had to take a few years for them to kind of be brought up. But whether it was a couple years or longer than that, we've gotten to a point where, yeah, like you said, Jessica, they don't seem to care, and they don't seem to be too bothered by what's going on in spite of the promises that they made. How do we see Nehemiah dealing with the issue of the Sabbath being broken?
Outrage.
Outrage? Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good word. In just a minute, we're going to talk more specifically and pointedly about everything that he does, but in verse 17, he confronts the nobles and says, what is this evil thing that you're doing, profaning the Sabbath day? And he reminds them that this is part of what got us into this trouble in the first place. And he shuts the gates and he puts his servants in place, and he says to the traders, you better not come back here. I like the way that it's recorded that a time or two, the foreign traders camped right outside the gates. Maybe this rule will get bent, or maybe people will just come visit us right outside the gate and we won't go into the city. And Nehemiah, he threatens them and says, I'm going to lay hands on you if you keep doing this. And I think it's neat the way that it says it happened a time or two. They got the message. Like, maybe the people of Israel wouldn't get the message, but these foreigners got the message that this was going to be something serious. And then in verse 22, he puts a more permanent solution in place, because Nehemiah has to prepare for a time where he and his servants can't do everything. And that's what he's tried to do up until this point, but the people have slid back. And so he tells the Levites in verse 22, it's going to be your responsibility to take care of the Sabbath, to be the ones guarding the gate, and to be making sure that nothing transacts on the Sabbath that's not supposed to. All right, and then from verse 23 on down, we have the problem of foreign marriage. The people, again, had sworn their faithfulness here. Chapter 10 and verse 30, they say, we are not going to give our sons or daughters to foreigners in marriage. We're done with that. And they make that vow and they sign their names to that. And yet here in chapter 13, we're right back to the problem. Verse 23 says that I saw the Jews had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Every direction, all the peoples right around us were again being welcomed into the Jewish family. And so how does Nehemiah deal with that issue?
He reminds them of Solomon.
Yeah.
Someone who should have respect, at least culturally, in their eyes. And he's trying to make a comparison to the blessings that Solomon had from the Lord and the blessings that we could have. I think it's really easy for us to yell at the townspeople, but where are the Levites? Where are the teachers? Oh yeah, they're in their fields trying to make a living for themselves. And so it's almost like God intentioned for these priests to be taken care of so that they can teach other people. But we don't have that anymore.
Right. Well, and look at verse 28. They weren't immune from the problem either. One of the sons of Jehoiada, son of Eliashib, the high priest, so a descendant of the high priest, was the son-in-law of Sanballat. Tobiah crops back up. Here's Sanballat. And so not only are the leaders not leading in their teaching and what they're doing, they're not even getting it right personally. And you brought up a good reference to the history of Israel. You might have noticed before he gives the admonition and the scripture reference, he does something even a little more drastic, right? Verse 25, I confronted them and cursed them and beat some of them and pulled out their hair, and I made them take an oath. He doesn't lead with, hey, you probably shouldn't be doing this, that's where I want to take our discussion in just a second, is he gets very, very serious about the issue and how he deals with it. It's interesting to think about one of the sources that I was reading in my prep for the class talked about the explosion of Nehemiah and his anger and the implosion of Ezra and his anger. So these are kind of parallel books, and flip back a few pages and look at Ezra chapter 9, because a similar thing happens where Ezra, just a little bit earlier, a generation or so earlier, comes and he hears about the problem of intermarriage. So in chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, they tell Ezra the people have not separated and they've married in to these foreign people. And then let's start in Ezra 9 and verse 3. As soon as I heard this, I tore my garment and my cloak and pulled hair from my head and beard and sat appalled. Then all who trembled at the words of the God of Israel, because of the faithlessness of the returned exiles, gathered around me while I sat appalled until the evening sacrifice. And at the evening sacrifice I rose from my fasting with my garment and cloak torn and fell upon my knees, and then he begins to pray. And so you see kind of two different responses from the leaders of the people in this era. Ezra sort of takes it upon himself, and he tears his own garment, and he tears his own hair, and he prays to God. Nehemiah is maybe a little past that point at this stage, and he's going to pull somebody else's beard, and he's going to grab them, and he's going to say, "What are you doing? Promise me you're not going to go back down this path." And so let's go ahead and get there. I'll come back to this, but I wanted to map this out because I want you to look at this list of some of the things, not even all of the things, that Nehemiah does in chapter 13, and then I want your thoughts on it. How does this read to you? Is Nehemiah in the right here? Is he going a little crazy? Let's see your thoughts on this. In verse 8, I was very angry and I threw all the furniture out of the temple. In verse 11, I confront the officials and I say, "Why is the house of God forsaken?" In verse 19, on the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors be shut and not opened. In 21, one of the best verses of this chapter, I warned the merchants, "I will lay hands on you." 25, I confronted them and cursed them and beat some of them and pulled out their hair. And in 26, I made them take an oath. So these are the actions of Nehemiah when it comes to dealing with the sin of the people. And I want your thoughts on sort of how does that read to you and what should we think about that? But Jay, you have something first?
Well, if you think of us, it almost sounds like he's out of control crazy, but I would actually argue that it's measured response. And how I would say that is, think of what he did to the merchants. He actually threatened them and gave them a chance. And I think the American Standard said, "I will use force against you," which I also like that version, as well as "thou lay hands on you." But when it came to his own people, he specifically went right for their hair.
Yeah.
He went for I'm going to start beating you now because I don't want to compare it to being a parent, but there's kind of that idea like, okay, you've known better. I've told you this over and over and over again. Versus he warned people who probably maybe even didn't know better because, hey, they were coming in and doing business with the Jews who didn't seem to mind. So what do they know?
Yeah.
So I kind of see it that way. His response was kind of in direct correlation to the behavior.
No, good thought. I like that a lot. So the people who didn't know better, he was still giving a chance, and he warns them, and he gives them a couple times. Yeah, you don't want to do this, And then with the Jews, yeah, they've had every chance, and they've heard the word, and they've said we're going to be faithful, and he comes back, and it's seemingly beyond the time for just another rebuke and another correction. Like we got to get really serious about this. What else? I want to hear some thoughts on this activity. Yeah, Nick.
I completely understand that. So I can definitely understand this, in part because if you ever worked so hard on something to watch it fall and to watch it not be what you intended it to be, it's disappointing in itself. But some of these things feel really intimately betrayal. Like, not just they've turned away, but they've turned away specifically to these enemies that Nehemiah fought against the entire book. Tobiah living in the temple, like that's not just a betrayal, that's an intimate betrayal of the house of God with a direct enemy of Nehemiah. And then I think it's the grandson of the high priest marrying Sanballat's daughter. Like, that's not just marrying foreign women, that is directly marrying the daughter of an enemy of Israel. It feels like a very intimate betrayal, so it makes sense to me.
Yeah. So in verse 27, he says, "Shall we then listen to you and do this great evil and act treacherously against our God?" Like that's the word he uses. This is treachery. This is just the worst backstabbing betrayal that there could possibly be by the way you're conducting yourself. Yeah. So I see that. Good. Some other thoughts on this?
I think we need to applaud Nehemiah for stopping the people and teaching them before the Lord has his justice with them. The Lord is not going to put up with this. He hasn't. These people just came back from a brutal exile. And so if there's going to be some minor confrontations about not following the law, I think that's going to be a whole lot more gracious than how God deals with people who blatantly turn their back on him.
I would be interested to hear your comment on this because I feel a little uncomfortable with a couple verses in here. One of the things that we talk about when we read through the Psalms, do you need me to not make a comment?
Yeah.
when you read through the Psalms, especially the imprecatory Psalms of, may God, I want your babies' heads to be smashed against the rock of my enemies. The comment that we always make is we say this is on God's behalf. Like, I'm offended because God is offended. But I see a lot of personal stuff in here. Like verse 14. Remember me, O my God, concerning this. Do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for his service. And then the very last verse that he says, remember me, O my God, for good. And I feel like every single thing that people are saying in this class, I really do. Like, it's Nehemiah has done good, and he's worked hard, and you can tell that he takes this personally. You're not only offending God, you're undoing my life's work. Like, and a little of me feels a little uncomfortable with that. Also, I feel it personally. And I was looking around here a minute ago, and I'm looking at people like, I was looking at Ben and Lisa, and I'm thinking of Tim over here, and like, in this congregation, in the last however many years, we have worked really, really hard to cultivate peace and unity within this church family. And I think of this when I look at these different people, like all the suitors and all this. When a rabble-rouser comes in and starts disrupting that unity, I want to ball up my fist. Like, this is too much of our life that we've put into this. And then I think about Jesus and his approach. Anyway, it's just, I don't have a comment, but more of a question and how I'm supposed to feel about this.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great thought. And that one of the things that I jotted down, I said, is it Nehemiah being frustrated over his legacy? Or is it the fact that God was being ignored? And I think it's more to the latter. Like, the way that he'll sprinkle in the prayers, to me, was indicating he's still seeking God in all of this and trying to do it in a way that was going to win, God's approval and to be corrective. But I will say, like, the first time that I read this chapter, when I was just reading through the book, studying for this class, I thought, like, oh, so Nehemiah just kind of goes crazy at the end. Like, he does a lot of good, and then he just snaps. Like, I can't see a situation where the right situation, the right play out of the playbook is to grab somebody by the beard and to make sure that they get a few good wallops, until they understand. Like, that it doesn't sort of align with, I guess, our modern sensibilities. And, it made me wonder, like, is this well-intentioned but just a little bit overboard? But, from the discussion today and from things that I was reading, I think most people will ultimately kind of come down on the side of, this is what you had to do. And one of the things that I thought was interesting that I might share, and first we'll do this. If you do so again, I will lay hands on you. I usually Google the chapter on Google Images and see the inspirational Bible verses, and someone jumping for joy with the joy of the Lord. And I kind of was amazed that somebody made this one. So if you need a new phone background, you can just look up that verse and go from there. But I jotted down a few thoughts because as I started to dig into this more, I think my conclusion is this is largely justified, even though it's uncomfortable in terms of how it goes down. So one, beating was something that was allowed under the law. Remember, the Jews could give 40 lashes, in a legal proceeding way. And is that what's happening here? I don't know. One of the commentaries said that this, the laying hands on them or the beating was to sort of sentence them to this punishment and have it carried out, not just Nehemiah swinging his fist. The cursing is not the way we think of cursing. The cursing is the curses of the covenant. You've agreed to the covenant. You've said you were going to do this. You've broken it. Now all you have to look forward to is God condemning you. The anger, as we've talked about, was because history is repeating itself, and Nehemiah is trying to say, don't you get it? We just came out of this. We just came back from captivity. We can look back at all the different examples, that whether it's Solomon or whether it's our ancestors before captivity, they didn't honor God. They didn't seek him. They didn't do things the right way. and it led to their ruin. And aren't you going to learn from that? Aren't we ready to make a change? That's what we promised. With him cleansing the temple, I'm sure many of our minds went to Jesus and what he did. And that was not a mild action. That was cords and whips and driving people out and overturning the tables. And like I mentioned, he is following up his actions with prayer. So I'll leave that with you. There's one more thing that I want to get to in class this morning for you to think about and sort of to evaluate everything that happens. But one thing I think we can say for sure is that you have to appreciate the zeal in getting sin out, in cleaning house. And I'll just give you one opinion, which I try to not throw too many of them out during the class. But in my opinion, we typically err by not being serious enough about sin and by being too complacent and too comfortable and too, oh, it's okay, you can be part of the family, like we're just going to allow this. And maybe if we're going to mess up, it's not the worst thing to mess up in being so fired up about the problem of sin that we're going to get it out. And if I run something over in the process, I'll fix that. Obviously, you don't want to, it's good to stay away from either extreme, but maybe we shouldn't be so critical of someone who is saying, God does not tolerate sin, you are the people of God, you are distinct, you are set apart, we're not going to have this anymore. You take an oath, verse 26, you promise me that this is not going to be part of what we do anymore. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from that. So here's what I want to do for the last 10 minutes. How do you think the people found themselves in this place? Play it out in your mind a little bit. How did we get in a circumstance where Nehemiah leaves, he walks, down off the hill of Jerusalem, and he's headed back to Persia, and things are in order? How do we get to the point where chapter 13 picks up, and there's so many compromises, and there's so much immorality? How do you think that happened? Go ahead, Nick.
There's sort of this idea of a slippery slope. I don't know if these things cause one another, but you can sort of picture in your mind that we stop giving the portions to the priests and the Levites. They have to go back, work out in the fields, so the people aren't being taught about the law nearly as much as they should have. Therefore, they don't know about Solomon and how he had these struggles with foreign women. And so they end up marrying foreign women, and then they raise children who are kind of half Israeli and half foreigner, and those people don't know the law either. And it's just sort of one thing after another, whereas if you don't quench the sin when it pops up the first time, you're kind of snowballing into these bigger issues.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think there's definitely an interconnectedness between the problems that we see, that they will feed into each other in kind of a vicious cycle instead of the virtuous cycle that was trying to be set up of knowing the law, understanding the law, being faithful to the law, being encouraged by your brethren. Like now we're descending in the opposite direction. Good. Other thoughts? Kevin?
I think you see him addressing kind of the leadership level, the nobles, the high priest. They essentially have turned a blind eye or even joined in on some of the problems that have occurred.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, when Nehemiah is there standing in the gap, things are largely going the way that they should be, or at least getting back to that. And then he leaves and has to entrust other people with it, and they didn't have nearly the same attention and focus and care on doing things the right way. Yeah. Barry?
I just thought it was interesting to think about Tobiah and Sanballat and how slippery they must have become to get back into the group. You kind of know how personalities can work out. Possibly they are just befriending people and making people feel comfortable with them again. We're really not the bad guy. And so they moderated their outward aggression as they had before. And now they're wanting to get in with the group again. And people then get relaxed. That happens today all the time.
Yeah.
Where you can, they're nice guys. They're all, look at the family. I mean, the daughter was in love. What do you want?
Yep.
And it's just easy to think about how easy it is for us to overlook things after a while just because of the personalities.
Yeah, good thought. And to me, that called to mind the end of chapter 6. We've got this detail that Tobiah was sending letters back and forth to people, and he had some people who were saying, like, oh, Nehemiah, you need to hear the good deeds of Tobiah, and like he's not all bad, you're oversimplifying things, and it says that some were bound by oath to him, and they had business dealings or family dealings or something, and so they were already compromised and were kind of working on his behalf. Here's a couple things that I was thinking about. Yeah, go ahead, Becky.
I was just thinking about what you talked about before with the people maybe needing to work because the taxes were high or, just so they could eat. And how, to me, that seems like a super reasonable reason to think you need to work on the Sabbath versus like us who we can't even be bothered to come to services for things much less important. It's not like I'm worried if my kids are anything today. I just have a super fun event or a game that's more important.
Mm-hmm.
And then also with the intermarrying, I was thinking about like today when we make our choices about who we marry, and we join ourselves with somebody that's not like on the same path with us at all. Why do we do that? Why did they do that? And I don't know. I just think maybe sometimes we think it'll be fine. Like I can't find somebody that feels the same as I do, that's tracking the same direction as me. So this is the best I can do, and that's worth it because I want this instead.
Right.
So,
I think when you're thinking about this chapter, to me, one of the biggest lessons is the influence that people have on us and how easy it is to think that we'll influence them and they won't influence us. And just repeatedly throughout the New Testament, there's this idea that a little leaven leavens the whole lump. A little bit of corrupting influence, a little bit of evil, a little bit of somebody you're around who you shouldn't be around. How much more if you let them in to be your spouse? But just being around the people who aren't going to be pulling us in a positive direction can really damage us and send us in the wrong way. So, I think we can look at Nehemiah 8 through 12 at the Reform, and we say they didn't backslide because they didn't care, or they didn't even ever try, or they didn't know the law. They had all of those things. I think there was a genuine, diligent seriousness that started, and it probably didn't happen all at once, like we've talked about. And you all were touching on these same things. I think the most likely, and yeah, I'm speculating a little bit here, but I think you'll see the point. It was one harmless, quote, compromise at a time. Hey, Tobiah, he needs a place to stay. He's my relative. I can do this favor for my family. Hey, family first, right? I'm just taking care of family. How bad could that be? There's always a way we can justify things. Or, we weren't going to give our son to just some unbeliever, but she just seems so nice, and her family's so nice, and her family's so successful, and she's a good person, and she says she's open-minded. So you know what? Like, I know what we said, but now this is different. We've talked about, hey, I would love to give to the work of the Lord. I want my money and my efforts to go to him, but times are tight. I'm just this Sabbath day, I'm not going to give. I'm not going to do my offering, but I will in the future. And you can see just how maybe little by little we get to this point where Nehemiah comes back into town and things are in shambles. And I hope that the lesson is relatively obvious from that, of just being aware of a little bit of backsliding and of our tendency to do so. I thought of Hebrews chapter 2, 1 through 4 talks about we need to be really careful lest we drift away. And it's often a much more gradual process of sliding back. And I think for us, one of the best lessons of Nehemiah is you can have all the best intentions, you can know the word, you can want to get close to God, you can promise that you're going to do better, but we have to be faithful in terms of the everyday decisions. And then I want us to actually end over in Romans chapter 7, because there's kind of 2 points that I think are worth bringing out. One is that we need to do our absolute best to be faithful and to follow through on our promises and our commitments and our vows. On the other hand, were the people ever going to follow the law absolutely faithfully the way that they promised? No. No one could, right? The law in some ways, and I think some of what we see in the book, is that you can promise and you can vow and you can say, I'm going to be faithful this time, and yet we all sin and we all need grace and we all needed something better than the law that we couldn't keep perfectly. So Romans chapter 7 and verse 21, I'll pick up. And I wish I could give, sort of more of the full context and flow, but hopefully you'll get the idea. Romans 7:21. So I find it to be a law that when I want to do right, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God in my inner being, but I see in my members another law, waging war against the law of my mind, and making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then I myself serve the law of God with my mind, but with my flesh I serve the law of sin. There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. For the law of the Spirit of life has set you free in Christ Jesus from the law of sin and death. For God has done what the law, weakened by the flesh, could not do. By sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh and for sin, he condemned sin in the flesh, in order that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us who walk not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. So where I want to end today is by thinking not only that we need to be diligent to do our part, and when we make a promise and when we say we're going to be faithful, we ought to be faithful, but also appreciating the plan of God, that no longer are we under a law where we vow and we try and we commit, and yet we fall short and we're under conviction and there's nothing that we could do about it. But I think the end of Nehemiah starts to point us towards the need for Jesus, that we've done this reform, we've tried to rebuild, and yet we're still pulling our hair out over sin. We're still not there. We had a great leader, we had a great commitment, we had a great vow, but we need a better reform, one that's going to come a few hundred years after that, and that's Jesus. Thank you for your participation. For next time, we're going to review, so I'd really encourage you to read the book and just think about it, see what stands out, and we're going to share takeaways and lessons learned. Thank you.